Hashtag they broke the oldest galactic law, never cross humanity. Hashtag part 1. The Galactic Conclave had one rule that was older than almost everything else. It was written before most of the member species had even discovered how to travel between stars. It was short, simple, and had never been broken in over 300 years. Every species that joined the conclave had to agree to it. They had to sign it, speak it, and promise it in front of everyone else. The rule was this: never attack Earth. Never strike at the core worlds of humanity. Most species thought the rule was strange. Humans were not the biggest. They were not the oldest. They were not the most advanced. When they first arrived in space about 400 years ago, they were almost funny. Their ships were slow and leaked radiation. Their diplomats brought strange food to meetings. Their weapons were weak compared to the great empires of the galaxy. But the older species knew something the newer ones did not. They had seen what humans did when they were pushed too far. They had seen it once, a long time ago, and that was enough. The Dravaki had been a powerful empire. They were strong and fast and had dozens of worlds under their control. About 280 years ago, they had attacked a small human colony called Kashan 4. It was a poor planet, not very important. The Dravaki wanted its resources. They thought the humans there would run or beg. They were wrong. 3 months later, a human fleet arrived at Dravaki space. It was not a clean or beautiful fleet. The ships were built from old parts, from mining machines, from cargo vessels that had been fitted with weapons. The people flying them had not slept properly in weeks. They were not calm. They were not afraid. They had one single goal and they did not stop until it was done. The Dravaki lost 9 worlds before they asked for the fighting to stop. After that, the Conclave wrote the rule and put it in the charter. They made every species agree. Some agreed because they were afraid. Some agreed because they were wise. A few agreed and then forgot why the rule mattered, because 300 years is a long time and memories get short. The Sulhari were one of those species that forgot. They were not an old empire. They had only been traveling through space for about 2,000 years, which was not very long by galactic standards. In the last 60 years, they had joined the Conclave and grown fast. They took new territory. They made deals, some of them fair and some of them not. Their leader, a tall and powerful creature named Vel Soreth, believed very strongly that strength was the only thing that mattered. He believed that rules were for weak species who could not protect themselves. He had watched humanity for years. He saw a civilization that had not fought a large war in 80 years. He saw traders and builders and diplomats. He saw a species that smiled at meetings and offered to share food and wanted to talk about culture and music and scientific cooperation. He decided they were soft. His generals were not so sure. One of them, a female named Sura Keth, tried to speak carefully in one of the War Council meetings. She mentioned the charter. She mentioned the old stories about what had happened to the Dravaki. Vel Soreth did not want to hear it. "Those are old stories," he said. He stood at the center of the war room on his flagship, looking at a glowing map of human space. The Dravaki story is fear dressed up to look like history. Humans have not fought in 80 years. They have grown comfortable. They have forgotten how. He pointed to a planet on the map. It was called New Carthage. It was one of humanity's larger outer worlds, far from Earth, sitting near the edge of human-controlled space. It had about 40 million people living on it. Farmers, workers, families, teachers. Ordinary people living ordinary lives. "We take this world," he said. "In 72 hours it will be ours. Then we tell humanity to give us access to their outer trade routes, or we make things very bad for those 40 million people." Nobody in the room said anything. The strike fleet launched the next morning. It arrived at New Carthage without warning. The planet had defense systems, but they were not built for something this large or this fast. The Sulhari ships moved into orbit and began their work before anyone on the surface could do more than sound an alarm. The northern continent was hit hardest. The bombardment lasted 2 hours. It was not meant to destroy everything. Vel Soreth wanted the planet to be usable as a bargaining chip, not a ruin. But 2 hours of bombardment from orbit was still a terrible thing. Cities collapsed. Fires spread for hundreds of kilometers. The sky turned a dark, thick orange that blocked out the sun. When it was over, the Sulhuri landing ships came down in the south, where the farmlands were and where the damage was smaller. Soldiers moved out, set up positions, and placed communication towers. A recorded message began to play across every working radio and screen on the planet. It said that humanity had 72 hours to begin negotiations. It said that access to the Outer Rim trade routes must be transferred to the Sulhuri Empire. It said that New Carthage would be held until those demands were met. Resistance, it said, would bring more bombardment. On Earth, the message arrived at a government office in Portland, Oregon. A woman named Laura Denny was the one who read it first. She was the Deputy Secretary of Interstellar Affairs. Her job was usually about trade agreements and cultural programs. She was not a soldier. She had never commanded a ship or planned a battle. She read the message twice. Then she called Admiral Greg Holt. "Greg," she said. Her voice was very steady. They hit New Carthage. There was silence on the other end of the call for a few seconds. "How bad?" he asked. "The northern continent is still transmitting." "Barely." She paused. "They burned it." Another silence, longer this time. "I will be at the Pentagon in 20 minutes, he said. Then the call ended. Laura put down the phone and stood very still for a moment. Outside her window, Portland looked like it always did. Quiet streets. Gray morning sky. People walking to work, not knowing yet. She thought about 40 million people on a planet that was very far away, looking up at smoke where the sky used to be. Then she picked up her coat and left for the office. In the conclave, the news arrived within hours. Ambassador Yin of the Valori species sat at her station and read the report once, then again, then a third time. She was old and experienced and had seen many bad things in her years of diplomatic service. But this made her sit very still for a long time. Around her, other delegates were talking loudly. Some were shocked. Some were angry. Some, from the species allied with the Sulhuri, said nothing at all, which was its own kind of answer. A delegate named Mora stood up and said that an emergency session had to be called immediately. The charter had been violated. The oldest law had been broken. There had to be consequences. Yin agreed. But what worried her more than the law was something else entirely. She had studied human history. Not the short version that most species learned, which was mostly about their early space travel and their trade networks. The full version. The wars, the recoveries, the patterns that repeated across centuries. She had read about the Dravaki. She had read what came before that too. She sent an urgent message directly to Vel Soreth through diplomatic channels. It was not long. It said, "You must withdraw. Immediately. Whatever you believe you know about these people, you are wrong. Withdraw from New Carthage and beg the conclave for a settlement. It is not too late to beg. But that window is closing faster than you think." She sent the message and then sat quietly, watching the chamber fill with noise and argument, and she hoped very much that Vel Soreth was smarter than he had appeared to be so far. He was not. His reply came back within the hour. It was polite, which somehow made it worse. He thanked her for her concern. He said the situation was under control. He said humanity would negotiate, because that was what civilized species did. Yin read the reply. She set it down on her desk. She had done what she could. What came next was not going to be something she could stop. She could only watch it, and perhaps, if she was careful, help shape what came after. Far away on New Carthage, under an orange sky full of smoke, people were still alive. Some were hurt. Some were lost in the ruins of buildings that used to be their homes. Some were frightened in ways that would take a very long time to heal. But some of them were doing something else entirely. Some of them were already thinking about what came next. They broke the oldest galactic law, never cross humanity. Part 2. Colin Voss was 38 years old and had spent most of his adult life building things. He had worked in construction for over 15 years. He had managed projects on 4 different planets, fixing water systems, putting up buildings, organizing teams of workers under tight deadlines and impossible conditions. He was not a soldier. He had never carried a weapon in his life. He was a man who wore a hard hat and carried a tablet full of schedules and talked to people until they found a way to solve the problem in front of them. When the Sulhuri bombardment hit, He was on the eastern edge of Harrow's Point, a mid-sized city on New Carthage's northern continent. The blast that destroyed the district office 3 streets away knocked him off his feet and blew out his left eardrum. He lay in the rubble for a moment, not fully understanding what had happened. Then the sky turned orange and the air filled with smoke, and he got up, because staying down was not something he knew how to do. He spent the first 4 hours after the attack pulling people out of the ruins of buildings. He did not count how many he found alive. He stopped counting the other kind after the first hour, because that number was the kind that could break a person if they let it get too large in their head. By the time the Sulhuri landing ships came down in the south, he had 11 survivors with him in a collapsed parking structure that was still mostly standing. They had water from a broken pipe and very little food. They had a cracked radio that still worked if you held the antenna at a specific angle. The Sulhuri broadcast came through clearly enough. Colin listened to it all the way through. Then he listened again. The people around him were quiet. A woman with a broken arm. 2 teenagers who had not spoken since he found them. An older man who kept asking about his wife, and Colin kept gently telling him they were still looking. After the broadcast ended, Colin sat with the radio for a while. He was not angry yet. The anger would come later, he knew, and when it did it would be the kind that lasts. Right now he was doing something more useful. He was thinking. He spent the next 2 hours finding more survivors. He moved carefully, staying away from the areas where he could see Sulhuri drones circling overhead. He kept the group quiet. He kept them moving. By late afternoon he had 27 people, and one of them was a woman named Dana Reeve. Dana was 41 years old. She had served 8 years in the Marine Corps before she left to grow wheat on New Carthage. She was not tall, but she was solid in the way that people are when they have spent years doing physical work in difficult conditions. She had a cut above her left eye that had dried into a dark line, and she was looking at the Sulhuri drones with an expression that Colin immediately recognized as professional evaluation. "You the one who organized this group?" she asked him. "More or less," he said. "Good." She looked around at the survivors. "We can't stay here. They'll do a ground sweep of this area within 48 hours. They want to know what's still standing and who's still here. Where do we go?" She looked at him. "There's a planetary defense depot about 18 kilometers east of here. Old installation. Looks like a grain storage facility from the outside. They won't have bombed it because there's no reason to think it's anything other than grain storage." She paused. "I know it's not grain storage because I used to run security evaluations for the Defense Department before I switched to farming." Colin thought about this for about 4 seconds. "What's inside it?" "Weapons. Equipment. Communication gear." She glanced at the orange sky. "And a tight beam transmitter that can punch a signal through jamming at short range. You think someone's coming?" Dana looked at him like he had asked if the sky was orange. "Someone's always coming," she said simply. "The question is whether we can make ourselves useful when they get here." They started moving east within the hour. Back on Earth, the Pentagon meeting room was full of people who were all trying very hard to sound calm and mostly succeeding. President Alan Burke sat at the head of the table. He was a steady man by nature, not given to large gestures or dramatic speeches. He listened more than he talked, which was one of the reasons people trusted him. He was listening now, to a room full of generals and cabinet members and 2 senators who had demanded to be present, and he was watching Admiral Greg Holt, who was saying very little and therefore the most important person in the room. General Patricia Osei, Army Chief of Staff, laid out the assessment cleanly. The Sulhuri had 41 warships in orbit around New Carthage. They had ground forces in the southern continent. They had 40 million civilian hostages and a 72-hour ultimatum that was designed to make the human government calculate the political cost of military action and decide negotiation was safer. "They expect us to flinch," Patricia said. "Will we?" asked Senator Doug Ferris. He was not asking it as a challenge. He genuinely wanted to know what was in the room. Nobody answered him directly. Alan noted this. "Greg," Alan said. "Fleet status." Admiral Greg Holt looked up from his tablet. He was a compact man, not very tall, with gray at his temples and the particular stillness of someone who had made very large decisions before and understood what they cost. "The 3rd Expeditionary is ready to move," he said. "Captain Nina Salazar has the ISV Resolute prepped and can break orbit in 6 hours. The Resolute is one ship, so she's not going there to fight. She's going there to watch, map, and transmit. Give us full intelligence on fleet positions, ground deployments, everything. He set down his tablet. The 7th and 11th carrier groups are 22 days out at standard FTL speed. Non-standard? Alan asked. 16 days. The drives will need work afterward. Nobody will complain. Total mobilization. Greg's expression did not change. If we pull inter-system reserves and frontier patrol groups, we can have roughly 300 combat vessels at New Carthage within the month. That's before the civilian conversion program. Laura Denny, who had been quiet until now, looked up. Civilian conversion. The protocol has existed for 80 years, Greg said. We haven't used it. Commercial haulers above a certain size can be legally requisitioned and fitted with weapons packages. We have about 4,000 vessels in that category operating in human space right now. The room was very quiet for a moment. Alan looked at Greg. If we commit everything, he said carefully, what are we capable of? Greg Holt folded his hands on the table. The Sulhuri Empire has 19 star systems, he said. I want to be exact when I say that we can make every one of them a problem Vel Soreth regrets having. Alan Burke sat with that answer for a moment. He thought about New Carthage. He thought about 40 million people and a northern continent that was currently on fire. He thought about the Conclave Charter and the oldest law and the species that had decided it did not apply to them. He made his decision the way he made most decisions, quietly, without theater, as if it were simply the next logical step and not something that would change a great number of things for a great many years. Tell Captain Salazar to move, he said. Captain Nina Salazar got the order at 4:17 in the morning, ship time. She was already on the bridge. She had been on the bridge since the news about New Carthage came in, not because anyone told her to be there but because she was the kind of person who went to the bridge when things happened. She was 34 years old. She had commanded the Resolute for 2 years. The ship was a heavy cruiser, fast, well-armed, built for difficult situations. It was one ship, and she was about to take it to a system with 41 enemy warships in orbit. She was not going there to fight. She was going there to see. She gave the order to break orbit. The Resolute left Earth's system within the hour, its FTL drive spinning up with a low hum that you could feel more than hear if you put your hand against the hull. Nina stood at the main display and watched the star map shift as they began the 16-day burn to New Carthage. She started drafting her operational plan for what she would do when she got there. She was going to go dark, no active signals, no radar, no communication that could be detected. She would deploy reconnaissance drones on her approach. She would map everything. And she was going to need a way to talk to anyone still alive on the surface, because the people on the ground were going to be her most valuable source of information. She did not know yet about Dana Reeve or Colin Voss or the depot 18 kilometers east of Harrow's Point. But she would. In the conclave, Ambassador Yin sat through 3 emergency sessions in 2 days and watched species argue about procedure and jurisdiction and what the correct formal response to a charter violation should be. She participated when she had to. She said the right things. She made the right motions. But in the quiet moments between sessions, she was reading. Old records. Human records, specifically. She was going back through everything she had gathered over 20 years of studying this particular species, looking for the patterns she knew were there. She found what she was looking for in the records from the Dravaki conflict, and from 2 smaller incidents before that, and from the long human histories that preceded space travel entirely. The pattern was always the same. Humans would absorb a blow. They would go quiet. They would assess. And then, with a patience and thoroughness that was almost frightening, they would begin to prepare. They were preparing now. She was certain of it. She looked out at the stars through the conclave's crystal dome and hoped that Vel Soreth would be willing to end this before those preparations were complete. She suspected he would not be. She was right. They broke the oldest galactic law, never cross humanity. Part 3. The Sulhuri had set up 6 communication relay towers across New Carthage's main continent. The towers were tall, metal, and built to be hard to destroy from the ground. They handled all communication between the orbital fleet and the ground forces. They also managed the jamming signal that blocked most standard frequencies. Without them, the occupation would go partially blind, not fully, but enough to matter. Lieutenant Aaron Park had identified all 6 towers within 48 hours of arriving at the depot. He was one of 11 military survivors in Dana and Colin's group, a signal specialist who had spent 6 years in the Planetary Defense Corps before taking a civilian posting on New Carthage. He was quiet and methodical, and when he spread his hand-drawn map on the depot floor and pointed to the tower positions, everyone leaned in to look. "We can't destroy them," he said. "We don't have the equipment and the noise would bring soldiers down on us within the hour. But we don't need to destroy them." He pointed to 3 of the 6 positions. "If we take out the relay connections at these 3 points, not the towers themselves, just the underground cable junctions, we create gaps. Dead zones in their communication grid. Their orbital command will still be able to reach 2/3 of their ground forces, but there will be blind spots." "Blind spots for what?" Colin asked. Aaron looked at him. "For whoever is coming," he said. "Because someone is coming. And when they arrive, they're going to need to know exactly where every Sulhuri unit is. Every ship position. Every gun emplacement. Every command post." He paused. "We can get them that information. But only if we have a way to send it. And only if we've created the gaps they'll need to use it." Dana studied the map. "The 3 junctions," she said. "How far are they from our position?" "Junction 1 is 4 kilometers south. Junction 2 is 11 kilometers southwest. Junction 3 is 8 kilometers east, through the old river valley. Guards. Junction 1 has 2 guards on a 6-hour rotation. Junction 2 appears unguarded, it's underground and they don't seem to know it's there. Junction 3 has 4 guards plus a drone patrol every 2 hours. Dana thought for a moment. "We hit Junction 2 first. Quiet, no guards, quick in and out. Then Junction 1 during the guard change window." She looked at Aaron. "Junction 3 is the problem." "Junction 3 is the problem," he agreed. A man named Kevin Lark raised his hand from the back of the group. He was 29 years old, and in his previous life he had been an electronic warfare technician. He had come to New Carthage 8 months ago on a routine contract job, helping to upgrade some of the planet's sensor arrays. He was not particularly large or physically intimidating, but he had a very specific skill that was suddenly very relevant. "I can handle Junction 3, he said. "I don't need to destroy the junction. I just need to attach a device to the relay cable. Something small. It won't stop their signals, it'll just make them slightly wrong. Corrupted positional data. Their ground forces will think they're in places they're not. Their orbital command will be working from a slightly incorrect picture of where everything is." "Slightly incorrect," Dana repeated. "By about 12 to 15%, Kevin said. Enough to matter in a fight. Not enough for them to immediately notice something is wrong." Dana looked at him for a long moment. "How long would you need at the junction?" 14 hours, he said. "It's a slow process. I'd have to work between drone passes, and I'd need to be very still and very quiet for most of it. You'd be lying in the open for 14 hours. In a drainage ditch, actually. It's covered. Not comfortable, but covered." Colin had been listening without speaking. He was good at that, listening until he had a full picture. Now he looked around at the group. They were an odd collection of people. A construction engineer. A former Marine who grew wheat. A signals lieutenant. An electronics technician. About 300 other survivors of varying skills and conditions, spread between the depot and 3 other nearby hiding spots. None of them had asked for this. All of them were doing it anyway. "When do we start?" he asked. Dana looked at Aaron, then at Kevin. "We start tonight," she said. 11 days after New Carthage burned, the ISV Resolute dropped out of FTL at the far edge of the New Carthage system and went completely dark. Captain Nina Salazar stood at the bridge and said nothing for almost a full minute. She was looking at the tactical display. The Sulhuri had 41 warships in a layered orbital formation. Standard defensive pattern, well-spaced, good coverage. They had also, she noticed, deployed a network of sensor drones in the outer system, which meant they were watching for exactly what she was doing. She had already accounted for this. The Resolute's stealth profile was good. Not perfect, no ship was perfect at this range, but good enough for what she needed to do, which was not fight or run but simply move very slowly and very carefully toward a position where her own drones could do their work. She deployed 17 reconnaissance drones over the next 6 hours, releasing them in small groups at irregular intervals so that no single detection event would reveal the full picture. The drones were small, cold-running, and designed to look like debris at sensor range. They spread out toward New Carthage on slow ballistic paths that would take days to arrive, which was fine, because Nina was not in a hurry. She was building a map. She was also trying to solve a communication problem. She needed to talk to someone on the ground. The Sulhuri jamming covered most standard frequencies. The tight beam transmitters that could cut through jamming were short-range by design. They needed a specific target at a specific position to work. She needed to know if there was anyone down there capable of operating one, and she needed to know where they were. She spent 3 days running passive sensor sweeps, looking for anything that might indicate organized human activity on the surface. It was difficult work. The Sulhuri were thorough. Most of the electromagnetic signals she could detect were theirs. But on the 4th day, very faint and very brief, she caught something. A tight beam pulse. Narrowband, non-standard encoding. It was not broadcasting any meaningful data. It was more like someone testing equipment, making sure it worked, pointing it in the general direction of where a human ship might be if a human ship happened to be nearby. Nina stared at her display for a long moment. Then she smiled, very slightly, and began working on a response. At the depot, Kevin Lark was the one who saw the answering signal come back. He had been monitoring the tight beam receiver for days, pointing it at different sectors of sky on a rotating schedule, not sure if it would ever find anything. When the return pulse came in, he read it 3 times to make sure he was not misunderstanding it, and then he walked over to where Dana and Colin were reviewing supply lists. "Someone's up there," he said. Dana put down the supply list. The signal from the Resolute was not long. It identified itself. It asked for their position and their situation. It asked what they knew about the Sulhuri ground deployment. Dana dictated the reply. Colin organized it. Kevin sent it. What came back from Nina Salazar was simple: received. Keep transmitting. The fleet is coming. Be ready to guide us in. Colin read the message twice. He passed it to Dana. She read it once, folded it carefully, and put it in her pocket. "How long?" Colin asked Kevin. Kevin did the math. If the fleet left Earth within a day or 2 of the attack, and if they pushed the drives hard, maybe 5 to 8 more days. Colin nodded slowly. Then he went back to work. In the Sulhuri command ship above New Carthage, Vel Soratha's chief strategist Pel Varis was beginning to feel afraid. He had been monitoring the patterns along the Sulhuri communication network for the past week, and what he was seeing did not fit the picture of a civilization preparing to negotiate. He had compiled his findings into a report and now stood in front of Vel Soratha's desk, trying to explain them clearly. "Grand Executor," he said, "they are not massing for a direct assault. They are dismantling our outer infrastructure. The relay station at Velcara, gone. The listening post at the Kashin corridor, gone. The defense satellites at Moran's Junction, gone." He spread a star map on the desk. "Look at the pattern. They are not surrounding New Carthage. They are surrounding us." Vel Sorath looked at the map. "They are cutting our communications. They are cutting everything. Warning systems, relay chains, long-range sensors. Grand Executor, we are losing our ability to see what is happening in our own outer territories." Pel Varis hesitated, then said what he actually thought. "They are not preparing to fight the battle. They are preparing the place where the battle will happen. They are making sure that when they arrive, we are blind and they can see everything." Vel Sorath was quiet for a moment. "How many ships can they bring?" he asked. Pel Varis had run the numbers 4 times because he kept hoping they would change. They did not. If they mobilize their full reserve forces and activate their civilian conversion protocols, which our intelligence suggests they have already started, they could bring over 300 warships to New Carthage within the month. Possibly more. He paused. "And Grand Executor, the civilian conversions are not finished. They keep building. They have not stopped." Vel Sorath stood up from his desk and walked to the observation window. Below him, the curve of New Carthage filled the lower half of his view. It was a green and blue world, mostly undamaged except for the dark scar across the northern continent where the bombardment had burned everything flat. He had expected humanity to call him. He had expected negotiations, offers, counteroffers, the slow careful dance of political calculation. He had expected them to weigh the cost of war against the cost of giving him what he wanted. They had not called. They had sent one ship, one single ship, to his system, and he couldn't even find it. His scanners had been looking for it since the reports first came in of an unknown vessel in the outer system. Nothing. It was out there, invisible, watching. Reinforce the orbital fleet, he said finally. Request additional warships from the home system. And find me that ship. Pelvaris left to carry out the orders. Vel-Soreth stayed at the window, looking down at New Carthage, and for the first time since the operation began, he felt the quiet specific weight of a decision that could not be undone. He did not withdraw. He told himself it was because withdrawal would show weakness. He told himself the numbers were still manageable. He told himself that humanity would blink first. He was still telling himself these things 5 days later, when his outer system sensors, the ones that were still working, picked up 207 ships dropping out of FTL. #They broke the oldest galactic law, never cross humanity. Part 4. 207 ships. They came out of FTL in a staggered spread, not a single point, because a single emergence point was too easy to target and Admiral Greg Holt had not come this far to make easy mistakes. The ships fanned out across a wide section of the outer system, and within seconds of arrival, every vessel had gone to full active sensors and was sharing targeting data across an encrypted fleet-wide network. The Sulhuri fleet above New Carthage had grown. Vel-Soreth had sent reinforcements, as Pelvaris had recommended, and the number in orbit had climbed from 41 to 93 warships. It was still not enough. But 93 ships against 207 was at least a fight. 93 ships that couldn't see properly against 207 that could see everything was something else entirely. The ISV Resolute was still out there, dark and quiet, doing its work. For the past 11 days it had been collecting every piece of information the reconnaissance drones could gather and routing it through the tight beam link to the surface team and from there to the incoming fleet. By the time Greg Holt's ships arrived, he had a complete map. Every Sulhuri ship. Every orbital position. Every sensor array. Every gap and blind spot in their coverage. He knew exactly where all 93 of them were. They could not say the same about him. Captain Nina Salazar received the fleet's arrival signal in the same quiet way she received most things, calmly, already thinking 3 steps ahead. She had been in contact with Dana Reeve on the surface for over a week now. The tight beam link was reliable. Dana's reports were precise and organized, which Nina had come to expect after the first few exchanges. The woman gave information the same way she probably ran everything else, clearly, without extra words, with exactly what was needed and nothing that wasn't. The ground team had done 3 things before the fleet arrived. They had taken out 2 of the 6 communication relay junctions. Junction 1 and 2 were dead. A third of the Sulhuri ground force could no longer communicate directly with orbital command. They had to relay messages through the remaining towers, which slowed everything and created lag in their response times. Kevin Lark had spent 14 hours lying in a drainage ditch, barely moving, breathing slowly, working with careful hands in the dark between drone passes. He had attached his device to the Junction 3 relay cable without being seen. The Sulhuri positional data was now corrupted by around 12%. Their command maps showed units in slightly wrong places. Small enough that nobody had noticed yet. Large enough to matter when things started moving fast. The third thing the ground team had done was identify exactly where the civilian population was being held. Dana had spent 4 days carefully mapping the Sulhuri positions in the southern continent, using survivor reports, observed drone patterns, and 2 very careful scouting runs that she did herself because she did not want to send anyone who was not absolutely sure they could move quietly and come back. Zone 3, as Aaron Park had labeled it on his maps, was where the civilians were. 3 main population centers, about 2 million people in total. The southern cities had been spared the bombardment, but they were now under occupation. The Sulhuri had ringed them with guard posts and made it clear that any trouble from the civilian population would bring consequences. Dana's one firm rule, from the beginning, had been simple: nothing they did would put Zone 3 at more risk. Nina forwarded Dana's full map package to Admiral Holt the moment the fleet dropped out of FTL. His tactical team spent 20 minutes reviewing it. Then they began. The Battle of New Carthage lasted 4 hours and 11 minutes. It did not look like what most species would call a battle in the traditional sense. There was no dramatic opening charge, no two fleets rushing at each other head-on. What happened was more like a very fast, very organized problem-solving exercise, where one side had all the information and the other side was discovering, too slowly, how many disadvantages they were operating under. Greg Holt's fleet moved in coordinated groups. Each group had a specific set of targets, specific approach angles, specific timing. The corrupted positional data from Kevin Lark's device meant that when the Sulhuri fleet commanders tried to respond to the incoming humans, their ships were not quite where the humans' intelligence said they'd be, but they were also not quite where the Sulhuri commanders thought they were. Coordination between Sulhuri vessels broke down faster than it should have under pressure. The communication gaps that Aaron Park's team had created on the ground meant that Orbital Command was getting incomplete information from the surface. Reports came in late, out of order, contradictory. The picture that Vel Soratha's commanders were working from was blurry at the edges in ways they could not fully understand. And the Resolute, finally visible and active, served as a mobile relay node for the fleet's targeting network, filling in gaps and making sure Greg Holt's picture stayed clear while the Sulhuris got worse. The Sulhuri fleet was not incompetent. They fought hard. Several human ships took damage, and 2 lighter vessels were destroyed in the first hour when a group of Sulhuri cruisers managed a coordinated strike before the jamming on that sector was fully cleared. 312 human crew members died in those 2 ships. Greg Holt noted each loss. He did not slow down. By the 3rd hour, 43 Sulhuri warships had been destroyed or disabled. The rest were trying to reform, which was difficult because forming up requires knowing where your allies are and their positional data was still corrupted and their communications were intermittently failing. By the 4th hour, the Sulhuri fleet commander, the same Drathvel who had received Nina's initial ultimatum and laughed at it, made the decision to scatter. He gave the order to break for FTL on individual headings. It was not a retreat. It was a rout. 32 ships attempted the jump. 20 of them made it. The other 12 were caught by the fleet's outer intercept group, which had been positioned specifically for this moment, because Greg Holt had anticipated it. The Sulhuri ground forces on New Carthage stopped receiving coherent orders at hour 3, when Orbital Command lost enough function to become unreliable. By hour 5, they were receiving a new transmission, this one from the human fleet, translated into Sulhuri by the fleet's language system. It said, "You have 2 hours to put down your weapons and move to marked surrender coordinates. We know where every unit is. We know your exact positions, your supply status, and your communication status. This offer will not be extended a second time." Within 90 minutes, most of the ground forces had complied. The ones who did not comply were located and contained over the following 12 hours. There were no civilian casualties during the ground operations. Dana's maps had been that accurate. The liberation of the civilian population centers in Zone 3 was not a military operation. It was just soldiers walking into cities and telling people it was over. Colin Voss was in one of those cities when it happened. He had been moving between holding locations for the past week, carrying information from one survivor group to another, helping Aaron coordinate the relay junction operations, and generally doing what he had done his whole life, organizing things, solving the problem in front of him, moving on to the next one. He had lost weight. His hearing on the left side had not fully come back. He had developed a persistent headache somewhere behind his right eye that he had decided to simply live with until there was time to do something about it. When the human ships appeared overhead and the Sulhuri drones disappeared from the sky and the occupation soldiers in the city square began receiving orders to stand down, he was standing in the doorway of a building that had once been a library, watching it happen. Around him, people who had been hiding in basements and back rooms for nearly a month began to come outside. Slowly at first. Then more quickly. Then all at once, the way water moves when a dam gives way. Admiral Greg Holt landed at a staging area on the edge of the city 6 hours later. His shuttle touched down on a city park that had been converted into a landing zone, and he walked down the ramp and onto ground that still smelled of smoke and something harder to name. Colin was there. He had come because Aaron had told him the Admiral wanted to speak to the ground team leaders. He was wearing the same clothes he had been wearing since the bombardment, which had been washed once in a river and showed it. He shook Greg Holt's hand without thinking of much to say. "How many?" he finally asked. He meant the civilian death toll. He needed to know the actual number. Greg Holt's face was controlled in the way that people who have learned to manage weight learn to look. The final count is still being done, he said. The Northern Continent assessment will take weeks. Current estimate is between 2 and 4 million. Colin absorbed this. He looked at the ground for a moment. Dana Reeve, he said. Kevin Lark. Aaron Park. The others. They need to be recognized properly. They will be, Greg said. Colin looked up. And what happens now? Greg looked at the sky, where the fleet was visible as moving points of light among the stars. His expression settled into something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite grief and held both of them. Now, he said quietly, we go have a conversation with the Sulhuri Empire. On the surface, soldiers were moving through the ruins of Harrow's Point with rescue equipment, calling out to rubble, finding people who had survived an entire month in the wreckage. Dana Reeve had gone north with the first rescue teams, quiet and focused, doing the next thing that needed doing. Kevin Lark had been taken aboard a fleet medical ship for treatment. He had come out of the drainage ditch after 14 hours with 2 cracked ribs from lying still on broken concrete, which he had not mentioned to anyone until after the battle. New Carthage was going to take years to rebuild. The Northern Continent was going to take longer than that. There were things that would never come back. But the sky above it was clear now, and the ships in orbit were human ships, and the people coming down to the surface were coming to help. That was enough for today. Tomorrow there would be more to do, and the day after that more still. That was how these things worked. You kept going, #they broke the oldest galactic law, never cross humanity. ## Part 5. The Sulhuri throne room was designed to make visitors feel small. The ceilings were very high. The walls were carved from dark stone and covered in the names and dates of Sulhuri military victories going back 1500 years. The floor was polished so well that it reflected everything, so that anyone who walked across it seemed to walk above a copy of themselves. The Grand Executor's chair sat on a raised platform at the far end, and the walk from the entrance to the platform was long enough to give a visitor time to feel exactly how far they had come and how much further they still had to go. Laura Denny walked across it without looking at any of it. She was the Deputy Secretary of Interstellar Affairs. She wore a plain gray jacket and carried a folder. She had 4 people behind her, 2 of them aides and 2 of them security, none of them in military uniform. She had made that choice deliberately. She was not sending a soldier to speak for humanity in this room. She was sending someone who spent most of her time reviewing trade agreements, because that was the message. Vel Soreth was already in the room when she arrived. He was flanked by 6 generals and his full court, and he was wearing the kind of formal Sulhuri dress that was meant to signal power and authority. He was very large. Most Sulhuri were larger than most humans. Vel Soreth was large even for a Sulhuri. Laura Denny did not appear to notice any of this. She sat down at the meeting table, opened her folder, and placed a document flat on the surface in front of her. "This is the settlement," she said. Her voice was clear and even. "I'll go through the main points." The room was quiet. Vel Soreth looked at the document without touching it. "The Sulhuri Empire will pay full reparations for New Carthage," Laura said. "The figure is on page 4. It covers infrastructure reconstruction, emergency aid, medical programs, and long-term environmental remediation for the Northern Continent. The number is large. It is not negotiable." She turned a page. "You will withdraw all Sulhuri military assets from the 6-star systems that border human space within 90 days. Inspection by Conclave-authorized teams will verify compliance on a monthly basis for the following 3 years." She turned another page. "You will submit to a full Conclave oversight program for the next 50 years. This includes access to Sulhuri military production data, fleet movements, and territorial expansion plans. You will also provide complete records of the planning and execution of the New Carthage operation to the Conclave's War Crimes Tribunal." She paused. "A number of your senior military commanders will appear before that tribunal. Grand Executor Vel Soreth will not be among them." That surprised him. She could see it. "We've decided," she said, in the same even tone, "that it is more useful for you to remain in power as someone who understands exactly what happened here. A lesson that stays in office is more valuable than a lesson that gets prosecuted and replaced by someone who hasn't learned anything yet." Vel Soreth looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "And if we refuse?" Laura closed her folder. She took a breath that was not a sigh and not quite a pause. It was the breath of someone who had thought about this answer for a long time and had decided to be honest. We mobilized in 30 days, she said. We built, fitted, crewed, and deployed a response fleet in 30 days. We have not stopped building since the day you hit New Carthage. The civilian conversion program is still running. The reserve fleets are still being activated. Our shipyards are still working extended shifts. She looked at him directly. We do not need you to refuse. We are already preparing as if you will. The only question is whether we stop because of this document, or whether we stop because there is nothing left to stop for. The room was very still. Vel Soratha's chief strategist Pelvari stood to the Grand Executor's left and stared at the table. He had tried, over the past 3 weeks, to explain this to Vel Sorath in a dozen different ways. He had shown him the numbers. He had shown him the patterns. He had shown him what happened to the Dravaki. He did not know if any of it had gotten through until this moment, watching his leader sit with the document in front of him and say nothing. I will have my legal staff review it, Vel Sorath said finally. Of course, Laura said. She stood. We'll be at the conclave station at Velthara. The review period is 4 days. She picked up her folder. I hope you use them well. She walked back across the long polished floor without hurrying, her footsteps quiet and regular, and did not look back. In the conclave chamber, the sessions had been running for almost a month. Ambassador Yin had done her work carefully throughout. She had made the formal motions, spoken at the right moments, supported the tribunal proposal, and made sure that the Lori position was clear and consistent. It had been exhausting in the way that important things usually are, not physically, but in the specific tiredness of caring about something complicated for a long time. On the last evening before the Sulhuri response was expected, she sat in the corridor outside the main chamber with a delegate she had known for a long time, a Fanaki named Moro. They had worked together on 3 previous situations and respected each other in the quiet way of people who have been around long enough to know what real respect looks like. How did they do it? Moro asked. His bioluminescent frills were their resting amber, calm and thoughtful. Mobilize that fast. I've been asking this since the battle. No one has given me a real answer. Yin thought about it the way she thought about most things, slowly, looking for the actual truth rather than the simple version. They don't fully stop, she said. That's the part most species miss. From the outside, humanity looks like a civilization at peace. They trade. They build. They send diplomats to every meeting and they remember everyone's names and they bring food. For 80 years they did not fight a single major war. She paused. But they kept the knowledge. They kept the protocols. They kept the legal frameworks for things like civilian conversion programs. They kept the design plans for weapon systems in archives. They ran training programs for reserve crews. They maintained the shipyards at low activity rather than shutting them down. She looked at her hands. Peace, for humanity, is not forgetting. It is choosing not to use what you remember. Moro was quiet for a moment. That is a strange way to live. Perhaps, Yin said. Or perhaps it is the only honest way, for a species that has learned what they have learned. She looked out at the stars through the dome. They have been attacked before. Not just the Dravaki incident. Before that too, in their own history, before they reached space. They have been hurt very badly, many times, by many different things. And the thing that did not change through all of it was that they got up again and they did not forget and they came back. The law in the charter, Mora said. Article 1. Is it really about fear? Yin considered this question. She had thought about it many times over the years. It is about respect, she said finally. Fear and respect can look similar from the outside. But fear wants to avoid something. Respect understands it. She turned to look at him. The species that wrote that article had watched what happened when humanity was cornered. They did not write the rule because they were afraid of humans. They wrote it because they understood that crossing humanity was not a military decision. It was a commitment. Once started, it would not end until one side ran out of the ability to continue. And humanity has a very particular relationship with running out. Moru's frills shifted briefly toward a cooler color. Meaning they don't. Meaning they don't, Yin agreed. The Sulhuri response came on the 4th day. Vel Soreth signed the settlement document in the presence of conclave observers. He spoke no additional words during the signing. He did not look at the cameras. He signed each page in the required place with the required biological notation and then sat back in his chair and stared at the wall. Pelvaris watched him do it and felt a complicated mixture of relief and grief. Relief because it was over. Grief because it should never have happened, and he had known that before it started, and knowing had not been enough. The reparations would strain the Sulhuri Empire for decades. The oversight program would limit their expansion for 50 years. The tribunal would take 2 years to complete and the results would be in the official conclave record forever. The 6 border systems would be demilitarized. The empire would survive, but smaller and quieter and watched, for a very long time. Vel Soreth had looked at humanity and seen softness. He had seen 80 years of peace and read it as weakness. He understood now, sitting in the silence of a signed document, what he had actually been looking at. He had been looking at a choice. A deliberate, sustained, careful choice that a species made every day, knowing what it meant and what it cost. They had chosen peace while being capable of exactly what had just happened to his fleet. They had chosen negotiation and trade and diplomatic meetings with food while carrying, somewhere underneath all of it, the full memory of every fight they had ever won. It was not softness. It had never been softness. It was control. On New Carthage, the work continued. Colin Voss was back on a construction site, which was where he had always been happiest, even if this particular site was the ruin of a city he had watched burn. He had a team of 400 people, a fleet of construction machines that had come down from the relief ships, and a list of priorities that was longer than anything he had ever managed before. He was fine with that. Long lists were just short lists with more patience required. Dana Reeve had gone north to the agricultural zones that were beginning the slow work of testing soil and deciding what could still grow where the atmosphere had been temporarily altered by the bombardment. She sent Colin a message every few days. Short, practical messages about logistics and resource requests and the occasional note about something she had found that was still alive in the ruins that had no right to be, which she seemed to take as a good sign. Kevin Lark had flown back to Earth for his debrief, as expected. He had sent one message from the ship. It said only, "Tell Dana the ribs are fine." One evening near the end of the second month of reconstruction, Colin climbed to a cleared section of high ground on the edge of the work zone and sat down and looked north. The sky there was still not quite right. It had an odd color at the horizon where the atmosphere was still settling. The smell of smoke was faint but present if the wind came from the wrong direction. A young soldier named Iris Grant found him up there. She had been assigned to the reconstruction detail and had been working with his team for 2 weeks. She was not a construction worker but she was a hard worker, which was enough. She climbed up and sat beside him and followed his gaze. "Does it get easier?" she asked. Looking at it. Colin thought about the question seriously. "The looking gets easier," he said. "What you're looking at doesn't change. You just get better at carrying it while you work." He glanced at her. "That's not a great answer." "It's an honest one," she said. They sat there for a while without talking. Below them the lights of the work camp glowed warm and steady in the growing dark. The sounds of construction carried up, machinery, voices, the particular background hum of a large number of people doing something that mattered. "Do you think it was worth it?" Iris asked. "What we did? The resistance, the risk. All of it." Colin thought about this for a long time. "I think it's the wrong question," he said finally. "Worth it compared to what? Doing nothing. There was no version of those weeks where we did nothing and it came out fine." He stood up and brushed dust from his trousers. "What I know is that when the fleet arrived, they knew exactly where to go. And they knew exactly where to go because people on the ground made sure of it." He looked at her. "That's not worth it or not worth it. That's just what you do. You do what you can with what you have, and you hope it's enough, and then you get up and do it again the next day." Iris Grant looked at the lights of the camp below them. Then she stood up. "We've got 2 more hours before the night shift change," she said. "Then we'd better get back down there," Colin said. They climbed back down the hill together. The work continued. The lights stayed on. Across the galaxy, 47 species read the settlement terms and drew their own conclusions. In the Conclave archives, the record of the Sulhuri incident was filed alongside the Dravaki incident and 2 others before it. The article at the top of the charter remained unchanged, as it had been for 312 years. Do not strike at Earth. Do not strike at humanity's core worlds. The law did not need to explain itself. The records around it explained it clearly enough. Some rules exist because the powerful write them for the weak. This one was different. This one existed because those who had seen what happened had the wisdom to write it down, so that every new species that came after them would have the chance to learn without having to find out the hard way. Most of them learned. The Sulhuri had needed to find out the hard way. They would not forget. And for the rest of galactic history, neither would anyone else who read the file and understood what was in it. That was the oldest law. That was why it was still there. And that was why it was never going to change.